Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local.
Okay, well, we could talk about that for a very long time, and it would be fascinating, but in the interest of time, let's move on. And one thing among several that were really interesting to me this week was there were two things that happened. So there was a John Mueller, who's Google, I don't know what his title is. He's like a webmaster liaison.
Webmaster
Yeah.
spokesperson. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So he was in it. He does these webmaster office hours, and people ask questions, and he responds to them. And one of the questions was about AI generated content, or auto generated content, as Google calls it. Is this how is Google treating this? And Mueller said, this is against our webmaster guidelines, which I think is a good position. I think if you read the guidelines, it's not as clear. And of course, Google is using auto-generated content itself in places like Gmail and now in Google Docs to create summaries of documents.
And in Google Business Profiles, as we talked about last
Yes.
week, which Greg Finn from the Marketing O'Clock team highlighted.
Yes.
The inherent contradiction there of Google violating its own guidelines in Google Business Profiles.
Right, exactly. So I mean, I think there'll be sort of creep that Google is concerned about quality more than the source of the content. And they say in their webmaster guidelines that simply posting auto-generated content without human editorial oversight is a violation. But what it implies is if a human touches it in some way or reviews it in some way, it might be fine. There was an article in the New York Times magazine. I saw it online, but I assumed that it showed up in the magazine, by Stephen Johnson, who is an author and was involved in a local startup years and years ago, whose name I forget. But anyway, so he wrote this lengthy article about OpenAI and the increasing sophistication of AI content, language understanding, and its ability to generate content. And so now you can get paragraph upon paragraph generated with simple prompts that apparently operate at the level of high school writing proficiency, which is pretty impressive. And that'll get better and stronger. And it's semi-instantaneous and it's cheap, at least sort of at scale. So it makes me wonder about what the future of search results will be, the future of content on the web, the future of news. There's already news sites that are using AI to generate sort of simple stories like weather reports and things like that. So are we facing some tsunami of machine generated content? And is Google sort of the last line of defense against a future where machines are, kind of responsible for much of the content that shows up online? That's kind of the question in my mind.
Some content lends itself better to this than others. For example, a summary of a ball game, there's a certain format to it with strict parameters and numbers involved than others. I would assume that low-hanging fruit maybe has already been being driven by AI.
Yeah, certainly in the fantasy sports world, we've had these automated write-ups that have been getting better and better and better over the last decade of my participation anyway.
Well, it raises
in terms of
go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say though, Mike, I think the ball game is kind of a perfect example here. I could actually see the combination of an artificially curated 30 to 60 second video summarizing the game with clips with an automatic text summary being actually much more valuable than most of the summaries that you get on a typical ESPN, $10 an hour beat writer actually putting out. So I think it's a reasonable use case. I think when you get into more,
why you should get plastic surgery.
Areas yeah, exactly. Areas that are a little bit more in the your money or your life situation. I think that those are just going to be harder to fake generally, and that lower quality content is going to have a whole bunch of bad user signals that Google's not going to like.
Well, so I'll raise 2 points. One is the point that you sort of implied a second ago, which is, does it really matter? I mean, this sort of is speaking out of the other side of my mouth. Does it really matter if the content is good, if it does what it's supposed to do? Does it matter if a human generates it or somebody in a developing country that's, paid very little, or a machine? I think that's an interesting philosophical question. But I was immediately reminded of the whole era of content farms in the sort of mid to late 2000. I don't know what to call the decade, the aughts, right? Yeah.
The odds.
When there were a lot of companies, Demand Media and others, that were paying these sort of teams of writers to crank out eHow and all these sites that were just trying to flood the SERP with content to rank, and then they were showing display ads, and it was a kind of a, I don't know, it's not exactly arbitrage. In some cases, maybe there was some arbitrage, but it was really all about getting display impressions and just generating article after article after article. And this would seem to be another way to do that sort of thing. And so I'm hopeful that Google's, holds the line on this, so we don't have lots and lots of crap and more noise and nonsense than we already do in the SERP.
Yeah, one area where I think it would be useful is helping to generate, for example, responses to reviews, where it provides the business with a unique response that the business could then modify, but then at least the business might be able to take the time to actually do it. I think there are use cases where it makes total.
Well, that's a little bit different, but I think you're right, and I do think that people are already using templates. So I think this is the next step, is just to create a more personalized response. And customer service is another area, for better or for worse, which is going to see a lot of this. I mean, you've got bots currently that are basically just regurgitating FAQs, and with something like this, you'll have much more sensitivity and much more personalized responses. And so that could be a good thing, or it could be just a rage-inducing thing, depending on how. When I get
the other piece, though, Mike, that you bring up a really good point. I mean, I think it's sort of self-evident at this point, if you've been in the industry long enough, right, that small businesses are terrible about writing about themselves. You can't sit a small business down in front of a keyboard and expect them to come up with 4 paragraphs of content about a particular service, but you can get them to record a 20-second video where they're explaining their service, and maybe you can run that transcript through AI and actually build out a much more useful consumer-friendly description of a particular service that a business is offering. So I see it as, it's definitely a double-edged sword. You don't want the eHow thing to proliferate, but it could give time-strapped sort of, non-professional writer SMBs a leg up in actually doing a better job of promoting.
I think that's an excellent point. More likely than not, what you'll see is agencies and third parties acting in an agency capacity, using those tools to do that kind of thing on behalf of the small business customer, I suspect. Mike, you were going to say something.
Well, I just think there was just 4 good business ideas in this last 15 minutes.
Well,
here.
so that's an article.
All.
Let's turn it into a piece. That's an interesting article.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.